Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your host, Phil Hawkins.
And Azaii Calderon Muñiz.
All right, guys, we're going to continue our discussion of why we do the things we do, even when we know that we shouldn't do those things. With a further discussion, I know last week we talked about classical conditioning. Now we I got surprisingly personal and fast food and my personal things kind of going on there. We're probably going to continue doing that a little bit today, but we're going to move past the classical conditioning into the operant conditioning. And just to clarify, in case for some reason this might be the first episode that you're watching, what we're doing here is we're walking through the AAMC's psych outline. We're specifically in section 7C. So we're about to cross over into 8A here in a little bit, but we couldn't go on without talking about operant conditioning, which is one of the most, I don't want to say classic because it's not classical conditioning, but it's a classic psychology topic. And operant conditioning is a really interesting, really powerful tool just overall.
Absolutely. Operant conditioning is one of those things where if classical conditioning is the baseline, what you do, operant conditioning is kind of the next step. Because if you listen to a lot of the examples that we gave last week with classical conditioning, a lot of it were innate behaviors, right? Simple responses. Whereas with operant conditioning, you can have a lot more complex responses. And I think that's what makes it maybe even a little cooler than classical conditioning, if I may say so. I
feel like there's just more thought into it as well. I feel like if somebody's trying to start doing something better or stop doing something that they don't like that they're doing, operant conditioning is the way that they do this. That's the way that people kind of focus on these things overall.
Yeah. And one of the most important things before we actually get started on the terms and whatnot is recognizing the goal of operant conditioning, right? It is to alter someone's behavior. Might be an animal, might be a person, doesn't matter. So to alter the frequency of some behavior, you either want to get someone to start doing something or stop doing something, right? And so with that goal in mind, you can decide whether you want the behavior to increase or if you want the behavior frequency to decrease. So if you want the behavior to increase, you want to make sure that someone, so I always use the example of little kids, getting them to clean their room or getting them to pick up their toys. It's a nightmare. It's so difficult sometimes, but I want them to pick up more toys. And so I want to reinforce the behavior when they do it. So that way, when they pick up their toys, they get a signal that, hey, this is what I should be doing, right? And then they increase how often they perform that behavior. Let's say, though, that they're getting into random fights. Right? I want to decrease the frequency of that behavior. And so I want to make sure that I decrease it. And I might do that by providing some type of punishment that's going to decrease the frequency. So with reinforcements and punishments, we're really focusing on, do I want the behavior to continue or do I want the behavior to stop? And that's kind of the first level of understanding operant conditioning.
Yeah, this just reinforcement versus punishment. As long as you're thinking about it in terms of do I want to do it more or less, right? That's the main idea here. I do want to pause just for a second I know we talked about Pavlov last week with the Pavlovian classical conditioning stuff. The main person for operant conditioning is B.F. Skinner. And Skinner is synonymous with operant conditioning. Most of his ideas in the realm of behaviorism, studying behaviors and how to change behaviors. Most of the stuff really just boils down to a lot of just operant conditioning. Do you want something to happen more or less? Now, where things get a little bit tricky is, adding some more terms to this to make it a little bit more complex. We have positive versus negative, operant conditioning. Now, positive doesn't mean good, right? Positive just means you added something, right? Negative means you took something away. And so I think most people think oh, there's positive reinforcement. That's a term that everyone hears all the time. And you would think you'd have a negative punishment sort of thing. But you can also have a negative reinforcement and you can have a positive punishment. So each one, punishments and reinforcements, they could be positive or they could be negative. Now, like, do you want to kind of think about like, are we adding something? Are we taking something away? And so some people might be like, wait, how can you reinforce something by taking something away? It's really obvious how you can reinforce something by giving something. Like if my kid cleans the room, I give them a sticker or something like that, just kind of like reinforcing that. But you could also do it in the other way by taking something away. Like, oh, if you clean your room, you don't have to eat your broccoli, or you don't have to do this other chore, or there's something that I'm removing from your life, generally something that you don't like, right? I feel like this works a lot better on like older kids where you're like, if you get like straight A's on your report card, you don't have to do chores next month, like for the entire month, no chores. And like that's removing something from their life. So that's a negative reinforcement because we're trying to increase this behavior, but we're doing it by pulling something out of their life. Now you could also, give them $50 or however much, like that's going to be a positive reinforcement. A negative punishment is whenever you take away something that they want, right? So like if you like some bad behavior, like the kid is coming home late, later than their curfew, right? And then like you would say like, okay, like no video games, right? Like you for a week, it's kind of like, grounding, right? Removing freedom. Grounding a kid is basically just an example of a negative punishment where you're taking something out. You could also do a positive punishment when you're adding something back in, right? Like if you don't like if you punch your sister, like that's a behavior we want to quit doing, right? Like if you punch your sister, then you have to eat extra broccoli, right? And then that's like, oh, that's like a positive punishment, right? Like, cause you're adding something to the kid's life to get them to stop doing something. And so I love that. Broccoli as punishment.
Not the punishments that I grew up with.
Yeah, me neither. I actually really like broccoli, so I don't know where that's coming from.
When you first said that, I was like, man, like I didn't like broccoli as a kid, but then as I got older, I was like, ooh, like, broccoli with some pasta with like some cheese or something. I don't know. Just make it.
I love it. It made me feel like a dinosaur that I was eating a tree. And so broccoli's the best.
So for you, then that probably would have been a reinforcer instead of a punishment.
Right. Yeah. I was a very hard kid to deal with, right? Clean your room and I'll give you some broccoli. And I'm like, all right, I'm in.
Now, the question is, how long would that last, right? Because like, they might be able to reinforce, or they might be able to use that positive reinforcement for only so long before eventually it doesn't have its effect anymore, right? And so that's actually really, it's really interesting. We'll kind of play with that idea as we keep going, of how we might actually, like the schedules that we use to reinforce behaviors, right? So if they gave you broccoli every single time versus if they now might have to switch this so that folks don't get confused. But if they, what's another one? If they gave you
like
some
chores,
food that
right? Like a positive punishment, like giving somebody chores to.
Oh, yes. So
I was right.
I had
you were thinking positive reinforcement. Yeah, that's why broccoli got confusing because some of the examples it's positive or it's good, some it's bad.
So chocolate. A lot of people like chocolate as a positive reinforcer. So with chocolate, right, you can either give the child chocolate every single time that they clean their room, or you might give it, without them knowing when it's going to come. And so that is referring to the frequency at which you reinforce the behavior is referring to either fixed or interval. Fixed being they know when it's coming.
Fixed set or a variable.
A variable, excuse me. Thank you. So with fixed, you know when it's coming, right? You know what the schedule is. You can anticipate it. With variable, it's random. They don't know when it's coming, right? So it might be, after 3 times the first time, and then it might be the next time immediately after, and then not for another 6 times, right? So fixed, you know when it's coming. Variable, you don't know when it's coming. Now, you can also reinforce based off of either the number of behaviors that are performed or the amount of time that passes. And so for that, we use interval versus ratio. So interval is time, ratio is number of behaviors. So if I say, okay, if I want the child, well, we'll get into that in a second. But if I say that it's, you're going to get rewarded after you clean your room 3 times, right? That is fixed. They know when it's happening, and that is ratio. It requires the engagement of the behavior a certain number of times. On the other hand, I might say, okay, I need you to, go clean your room, and then, I'll give you some chocolate in 30 minutes, right? That's fixed, but this time it's interval. It's based off of the passage of time. And so one of those is probably going to be more effective in getting the child to actually do what you want. But the idea here is there are 4 big terms, right? Fixed versus variable. Fixed, you know when it's coming. Variable, you don't know when the reinforcement is coming. Interval, time, ratio, frequency of behavior itself.
Yeah, it's really easy to get confused because sometimes people want to say like interval is the amount of time spent, and then ratio is the number of times it happens. And that's like very confusing because it's like time and time. So I like that, like the number of occurrences is a good way to word it to just kind of like prevent some confusion overall. But there's a lot of like interesting examples. And I kind of want to do a couple of quick examples where we're trying to figure out, okay, is this like reinforcement? Is it punishment? Is it positive? Is it negative? Is it fixed versus interval? And fixed versus variable and interval versus ratio. I did the same thing you did. And so, each one of those things, like this is how the MCAT likes to test this, is to like have you identify which one best explains this scenario. So let's say that I had a kid and this kid, I want to get the kid to play the piano more. And so I tell this kid like, okay, listen, for every hour you play the piano, I'm going to give you $5. And so, just you out there, like kind of thinking about this, like obviously, like that's a scenario that's very real world, right? Like if you're a parent and you want to get your kid to play the piano more, that's a good way to do it, right? Just like, I'm going to pay you for every hour, or I'll give you like a cookie or something, right? Like you're going to get a treat for doing something for so long. And so in this example where we're giving the kid like $5 for every hour they play the piano, how would that fit within these different categories?
So first, that would be a positive, right? Adding, reinforcer, increasing frequency of the behavior, and then fixed because the child knows when it's coming. And since it's time, it's interval, right? Now, while we're going through these examples, maybe we can talk about how like good they are at making the behavior stick, right? So if you know when it's coming and you just know that you have to do it for a certain amount of time, what's your engagement going to look like, right? Like if I know that's going to happen, then okay, I'll do it, but I'm going to decide, okay, is that amount of time actually worth it? Right. And so sometimes I'll do it, and I'll do it until I get bored, and then I'll stop. So I'll have some engagement, but it's not going to be the most engagement I could possibly have with the behavior.
Right. There's also this idea of like, if I'm going to give you $5 for every hour you play, you're not going to play for an hour and a half. Right. Like that, like after you get paid, like the $5, you're like, okay, now do I want to play for a whole other hour or not? Right. And so a lot of times that's why this variable or this fixed interval doesn't work as well, because like just kind of overall, it's like okay, I hit this amount of time. I'm not really into it after this. And so like, I'm just going to kind of quit because I just got paid. I know I'm an hour away from getting paid again. I only like have 45 minutes. I'm not going to do it. And so in a way, the way that this schedule is created, this kid will work for a little bit, but then eventually it'll be like, nah, I'm out. Right. And so like other schedules may like make them play for like an hour and 45 minutes or an hour and 30 minutes or an hour and 12 minutes. And so if your goal is to just increase this behavior, this variable or this fixed interval probably isn't the ideal. Actually, like interval is like the worst. And so is fixed is also the worst. And so like of all the different 4 possibilities of combining those, it's actually the least effective kind of overall.
Yeah. And on the flip side, right, what if, I like the example of the piano for time. I don't know if it works as well for like ratio, just because, you might have to like learn a song or something. But let's say that, let's try and use that same example. So you tell the child, okay, so every couple times that I see you play the piano, you might get something to enjoy, right? And so you go past the child one day and you sit there playing the piano, you just drop $5 next to them, right? And you just walk away. They're like, oh, okay, cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there's this, question of, okay, well, when's it going to happen next, right? They said I have to be playing the piano, but like I don't know when they're going to give me another $5. So okay, I might like go do something else, and I might come back and play again and see, are they going to give me
paid this time, right?
Yeah. And then, maybe not this time, but then the next time, maybe they do. Right. And so there's this wait and see. And so that wait and see, as you guys can probably imagine and are feeling as we talk about this, makes you want to do it more because you're like, when is it coming next? I'm excited. Right. And I want something, but I don't know how many times I'll have to do it.
Yeah. This is the most powerful if that's not clear. Also, just to like be clear on this example, this is still going to be a positive reinforcement because we're still trying to get the kid to play the piano, but now it's going to be a variable ratio based on like how many times does the kid sit down, right? If he sits down and plays the piano, he might get paid. He might not. He might play like 3 times and I pay him each time 3 times in a row. And then the next time I don't. And then I do again. And then I don't for like the next 5. And then I do again. And like this kind of like not knowing of when it's coming creates this idea in the kid's mind of like, maybe the next time I'm going to get paid. And it's not even like an amount of time. Like all I have to do is sit at the piano and like start playing and like, maybe I'll make $5. And like, that's a much more tempting thing, especially if you're like, I've got a little bit of time. I've only got 12 minutes. Like, okay, I'm going to like sit and play the piano. And like, eventually this is going to be a much better way to get the kid to play the piano long-term. This variable ratio thing, people are onto this. People who are trying to like, there's entire industries built around just trying to get people to like develop a behavior and work on a behavior and do something more and something less. I mean, that's pretty much what the entire field of marketing and advertising is. It's like get people to do this thing or not do this thing. And so like, that's kind of a big thing that, just understanding this has like gigantic implications kind of overall.
Y'all, slot machines, casinos, right? Like some of the most addictive behaviors people can have is gambling, and it's based off of this variable ratio and reinforcement schedule, right? Like you don't know when the payout is coming. You're just like, oh, it might be the next time. It might be the next time. Just one more time, right? But it's also not like you just sit at the slot machine and the money just comes out, right? You have to actually engage in the behavior. So that's why like these types of behaviors that are based off of, like Phil was saying, variable ratio are so long-standing, right? Like short-term, yeah, you can get a child to like clean their room if it's fixed interval with a short enough interval, or fixed ratio, with a short enough ratio, right? Like they'll do it because they know that they're going to get paid, but that's only going to last for a little bit of time. It's very short-term. It's not as resistant to like being lost, right?
Yeah. And I know some people out there might be like, well, the more time you spend in the casino, the more likely you are to win. But like, if you play one hand of poker and that hand of poker lasts 2 hours, like you're not any more likely to win that hand versus if that took you like 2 seconds, right? So it's the number of rounds you play, the number of times you pull the lever on the slot machine, the number of times you play roulette. So each time might be the time that you win the jackpot and you're a big winner. And so this creates this like really interesting like dopamine rush, and like addictive behavior is like, if we're really trying to get people to do stuff, this is important. And so obviously all of those are really like, I want to be careful saying negative because those are still like positive reinforcement strategies, but those are like societally negative things, right? Like addiction to gambling and things like that. But there's other things that are like also like maybe a little bit healthier, right? Like studying or eating healthy or exercising. And so if there's certain behaviors that you're trying to increase in yourself or in other people, like having a a variable ratio strategy will work better. Now, it's really hard to train yourself on a variable ratio thing because you know when you're going to like reward yourself. And so at best you could do fixed ratio, but that's still better than like a fixed interval. Interval tends to be worse than ratio. And so like a example for like the real world would be like, listen, like I reward myself with something. I'm not even going to go into what, but I reward myself with something every time I go to the gym or every second time I go to the gym. And so it's not about how long I'm in the gym. As long as I get myself to the gym, then like it's the occurrence. Like I don't have to spend an hour, just go to the gym. And that's a much better way to get yourself to go to the gym and increase the behavior of going to the gym more regularly. Now, if you say like, oh, I'm going to give myself a treat for every hour that I spend at the gym, like you're going to be like, nah, not really. No, not into it. But like, oh, I'll get myself like a Starbucks coffee if I go to the gym. Every third time I go to the gym, I get that reward. And so like that's way better than like this interval or time-based stuff. And once again, if you're trying to get somebody else to do it, like variable is even more powerful than the fixed. And so I have a friend who makes these deals with his mother-in-law. And so his mother-in-law is his accountability buddy is what he calls it. And so he says what he wants to do and she'll like help him, kind of like reach those goals. And theirs is actually kind of an interesting thing because it's actually a negative punishment system going through here. And so my friend, we'll call him John because that's his name. And what happens is like he sets out his goals for the month and he says like, these are the things I want to do this month. And he like tells his mother-in-law and his mother-in-law calls every week of just like, how are you doing on those things? And if he doesn't accomplish things, then he has to give his mother-in-law $50 that month. And it's just like this thing, like, he's like, I'm paying you to keep me accountable on these things. And I think that there's this extra thing of, because it's his mother-in-law, he cares about what she thinks. And so like, he's like, the money is like, really isn't that big of a part of it. It's just that like, I don't want her family to think that I'm like lazy and not accomplishing the things that I'm supposed to be doing. But note that that's a negative punishment system, or I guess that's a negative reinforcement actually, because it's trying to increase this behavior of doing this by like, he would lose money. It's kind of a weird thing. So I guess I would say it's more of a negative punishment because he's trying to decrease his laziness and he like gives money if that's the case.
If the MCAT were asking a question about this, they would have to specify whether
They have to be very clear.
Yeah, whether it's like, oh, they're trying to increase the whatever he's like trying to actually do, or
productivity, or decrease the laziness, right?
Decrease the laziness or decrease the bad relationship with the mother-in-law. So I think that's an awesome example because it shows that even the same, like if just taken from a different perspective, right? Depending on what the goal, like what the goal of behavior is, it can actually take on different schedules. So I think that's really cool. And I suspect I'd heard this before, but I don't know if it was during one of these recordings or if it was offhandedly. But I don't know if I would be brave enough to do something like that with an in-law.
Yeah.
But that's also, you bring up the point of money. And I don't think we had really talked about the difference between like primary and secondary reinforcers and strategies. And so primary would be something like food, water, the basics, what you absolutely, need biologically. Money is one of those things that it has an association with these primary reinforcers, right? And so society gives it value. And so therefore, because society has given it value, like it now has value as, a reinforcer or a punisher, depending on how it's used. So in this case, it would be like secondary, right? Using a secondary, punisher, reinforcer, again, depending on what behavior exactly we're looking at.
Yeah, this kind of like harkens back to what we talked about last week of like food being such a powerful motivator overall. Generally, primary reinforcers are a lot more powerful than than like the secondaries, just because there's something like biologically hardwired into us, like food, water, right? Like these are things that we are really looking for. Secondary things can be like pride. Like, I want like you'll get pride in doing a good job. If you do a good job, your in-laws won't hate you. Money, right? Like those are also good reinforcers. And I'm not saying that like they're like you'll never develop a pattern, like a behavior through this, because money can, while still a secondary reinforcer, can be a very powerful one. I mean, just think about like work. Right? Going to work. That is a behavior that people do. Most people aren't doing it because they love work, right? So why do they go to work? Well, money, right? Like money is the thing. And so they are paid to go to work. And so the company is doing this positive reinforcement of like giving you money to get you to come to work. And so that's like a real thing there. So I want to do just like a couple more examples of these, because I think examples always helps students kind of like latch on to these. So I know we talked about Millie a lot last week, who is my dog, but let's say my dog got on the couch. And so sometimes when my dog gets on the couch, I'll yell at her to get off. And so that's the scenario, right? My dog gets on the couch. Sometimes when I see this, I'll yell at her. Not always, but occasionally. So where would that fit in with this like positive, negative, reinforcement, punishment, fixed interval ratio, or fixed?
Positive.
Yeah.
You're yelling, you're doing something. Punishment, you want to decrease the frequency you want to decrease the behavior. It's sometimes, so it's variable and it's dependent on her actually getting on the couch. So it's ratio.
Right. That's one that like trips up a lot of people, because whenever I give this question to students, I say sometimes, and students think interval, but like it's not based on how long she's on the couch. It's based on how many times does she get on the couch. And so being really careful, just the word time doesn't mean it's interval. It kind of depends on how it's used overall.
I think of it this way, and this might be helpful for some folks if you fell into that category of, thinking that because you heard time that it was interval. So you can either like put away the same toy for 5 minutes or put away 5 toys in 1 minute, right? If you put away the same toy in 5 minutes and that's what you're getting rewarded for, right? You're dragging it out because it's based on the time, how long you spent doing that action. Right? If you are putting away 5 in 1 minute, right? That's because you're trying to get as many put away as possible because you're being rewarded on a ratio schedule. So thinking about whether this is something that is being done quickly or taking your sweet time, and how that affects the reinforcement or punishment schedule might be helpful in figuring out if it's interval or ratio.
Yeah, I do want to warn people that like while variable ratio is the best way to get a behavior to change, and we always use like the reinforcement scenarios, you can also do this with punishments, and this can be a very effective way, but it's a little bit like I kind of don't know if I like would endorse this as a kid thing. Like sometimes when you misbehave, I'm gonna yell at you, but you're never gonna know. You're never gonna know if it's gonna happen, like if you're gonna set me off or not. And like that's something that like just in the real world, like that can cause some like psychological trauma to children, but it is also like very powerful at getting them to stop a behavior of just like not knowing when the punishment's coming and that sort of thing. And so I guess like I feel like that's something like I'm not a parent, but a part of me is like I feel like at some point in my life I might be so stressed. I'm like, I just need you to quit like doing this thing, and I'm gonna like there's something going on here, but I'm gonna have to be like, okay, like a variable ratio is the best way to the behavior, but it's probably not the best psychologically for the kid. I feel like variable ratio for reinforcements works way healthier than variable ratio on punishments. But that kind of inconsistency that makes it a very powerful like tool for changing behavior also can make it a little bit like scary, and like kids kind of need some routine and some structure for their life.
Yeah, because there's this difference of like associating it with avoiding something like an aversion versus a fear response, right? Mm-hmm. And so the goal of these like behavior modifiers is not inherently fear, it's avoidance, right? So if like you're trying to decrease the frequency of a behavior, you want them to avoid doing that behavior. But what can happen, like you're saying, Phil, is that, you know, you might instill this fear, this traumatic fear response in a small child. And so I think that's why in general, and I don't know, I am also not a parent, so I am not, do not take my word for this, do your own research. But I think the like consensus last I had heard was that reinforcement is preferred over punishment when like working with smaller children, because it's less likely to lead to these like strong fear responses. That said, I know many of us were raised on a generally like a punishment schedule rather than a reinforcement schedule.
Like, wait till your dad gets home, you're gonna get a spanking, and I'm like, oh no, like when's it coming? And the dread, and right.
Yeah, exactly. There's I was talking with a friend, and folks in like the Hispanic community might be familiar with this, but like the idea of la chancla, like the sandal, right? That you get hit with when you get spanked. And we were talking about it, and they had gotten dressed up for Halloween, and they had dressed up as like la abuelita, like the grandmother. And I was like, oh yeah, next year you got to do the chancla. You got to go with the sandal. But like that's right, that like in some folks, that produces a very strong fear response. And, you know, there are like memes and videos on the internet about how, like, you know, like if someone like comes at you very close from behind and like, you know, you have this very strong response, or like, you know, they like lift their hand like expressively and like you have this very strong response, like, you know, there might be underlying like very negative associations that are still with you. And that shows, like you were saying, Phil, like the longevity of these reinforcement schedules. So all that to say, I agree with you. And maybe just with kids doing some research, but maybe it seems like reinforcement might be better than punishment. But just always keeping in mind that difference in goal of avoidance versus fear.
Right. This whole idea of operant conditioning is so big and like worth like spending a lot of time understanding, because there's a lot of people that are very involved in this. And so there's this one really specific case that I kind of want to talk about. And that's actually something we kind of hinted about last time. Last time we said that we were going to talk about people using their phones and like social media and things like this. And so I was reading a book about like habit formation, because you guys know I really like neuro stuff and kind of like what's going on with that. So at one point in the history of Facebook, so we're going to talk about Facebook now. As Facebook was growing as a company, they hit a point where their objectives needed to shift. And so at the beginning, they were focused on just getting people to use Facebook. And that was the main focus, get more people onto Facebook. You know, I feel like now that's like hard to imagine, but like I remember like hearing as a kid, like in high school, it's like, hey, there's this new website, Facebook. And now I'm like showing off how old I am. And that was kind of an interesting thing, because their goal was to just get people on it. But at some point they realized like, okay, if there's so many people on this, we need to focus not on just getting people to use Facebook. We need to focus on getting people to stay on Facebook. And so there's a new behavior that they're trying to increase. Right. And so they're trying to get you to get onto the thing and just stay there for like an hour or 2 hours, you know, like just searching through Facebook and kind of moving through this. And so it was a really interesting thing, because what they started off doing is like, I don't want to get into like the ethics of this, but there's a little bit of like murky ethics here of like, based on what you click on and how long you look at an image, and like, you know, before you scroll, they can kind of figure out what stuff you like. And they can figure out like, what are the things that you want to see more of. And so in order to get you to continue using this, they can keep feeding you those things. And at first what they did is they showed everyone just like everything that they think you're going to like, they're just going to give it all to you. Right. Of like this sort of stuff. But they found that like what would happen is people would get saturated, and they would just be like, okay, I've got everything I need. And they would just kind of move on. And this sort of like dopamine thing. And like, because it was just this constant dopamine rush, they'd start to develop this like resistance at first. And so after a little bit, they would just kind of like quit and like get off the website. And so what they did is so Facebook hired people from Vegas, hired people who worked in the casino industry. And there was like they like hired a bunch of people And this was occurring about the time of smartphone, like the iPhone sort of stuff developing. And so there's this like perfect storm of we need to get people to keep using this. And now people are carrying around with them. And so they hired a whole bunch of people who are built, like these people's career was built around keeping people to use like gambling machines and keep continuing to gamble. And so what they found was like people are way more likely to continue using Facebook if you spread out that stuff. And so they would like give you this like rush, and then you have to scroll for a little bit, and then they'd show you something else, and you scroll for a little bit, and they'd show you something else. So they'd like space it out, making it this more like ratio thing where it was like the number of things you would go through. And so you wouldn't get completely saturated to be like, oh, okay, I've got everything I want from this, and then move on. They're just giving you enough to keep you using the website and keep you using like looking at Facebook on your phone. And I remember reading this, I'm like, that's kind of scary that like this stuff is going on and like people don't even realize it. And so it's like Facebook in a way is trying to like tease you by giving you just enough to keep you scrolling and looking for more. And it's just kind of an interesting thing overall. And so just kind of understanding, when I say like operant conditioning it's like a big part of the world, like, getting like changing behaviors is what most businesses want to do, right? Like they want you to use their business more. And so like so much of the world is built around some of these ideas of operant conditioning. This isn't just about like how do you get your kid to play the piano and like how to potty train your kid. It's also about like the stuff that you do on a daily basis and what you're doing. And all of this is influenced by this operant conditioning, which is why it's really important to understand it a little bit better so you can identify when you're being, I don't want to say manipulated, but manipulated, when you're being kind of like pushed and like people are trying to change your behavior overall. Super interesting and a little bit scary, but super interesting overall.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I think like I recognized kind of where it was going. And it's weird because it's one of those things that like you and I both know, variable ratio is the most effective long-term schedule, reinforcement schedule. But just hearing someone like actually thinking about it in a calculated way, going out of their way to hire people to like, it makes sense that they would do it, but there's something just so wild and like viscerally about it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really interesting to think about. I'm sure that, especially folks who are listening, like you might find some of this in some of your other social media platforms that you're using even now, because I would not be surprised. I know a lot of like YouTube, TikTok, like most of these they'll ask you at some point every so often, like, oh, like, what did you think of this? Or like answer a question about the ad you just saw, or like, did this apply to little things like that. So they're actually getting your active feedback on how to make your schedule.
Right.
It's kind of wild. Yeah. Well, be smart consumers about your social media. But again, just another quick recap. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just feel like this podcast took a weird turn partway through this. It's like now this became about social media control and privacy and those sorts of things. But
we could go forever on that. Yeah. That's a whole Pandora's box. Yeah. But again, yeah, just a quick kind of recap. So we talked about the difference between reinforcements and punishments. So reinforcements increasing desired behavior, punishment decreasing an undesired behavior, positive versus negative. So positive, you are adding something, negative, you are removing something. It does not mean good or bad the way it means colloquially in, our everyday life. And then the different types of schedules. So interval versus ratio. So that's time spent performing a behavior versus the amount of times, the frequency that behavior is actually performed. And then fixed versus variable. Fixed, when it's coming. Variable, there's that anticipation, where fixed interval is the weakest long-term predictor of behavior success. That's to say, it's not going to last very long. You might get the behavior you want quickly, but it won't last. And then variable ratio, thinking, casino, slot machines, the strongest reinforcement schedule. So go forth and maybe don't train other people, but maybe use this information to help yourself build some better habits.
I like that. Use this information for good, right? Overall, because this stuff is Yeah, really powerful, helping you kind of develop your own habits, studying more, exercising more, eating healthier. Like I feel like everyone has these things. They're like, I need to do this more or do this less. I know we talked about that a lot last week, but this operant conditioning can be a very powerful motivator to get people to change their behavior overall.